Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. The current estimation that a marriage in the U.S. will end in divorce is somewhere between 43 and 45%. Divorce is also regularly cited as the second highest life stressor for Americans, just below the death of a spouse. Given the high incidence of divorce paired with the degree of stress it can incur, it's a good idea to know more about it. One of the top psychology experts in the field of divorce and child custody is my colleague, Dr. Michael Kerner. Mike has performed over 450 child custody evaluations, and he's been practicing forensic psychology since 1986. Mike is the recipient of multiple awards, including California Psychological Association's Distinguished Contribution to Psychology in 2018. Mike has been a mentor to many colleagues, and he certainly has been to me. His wisdom and gentle way of conveying it shows up in this interview. So listen in as a top child custody evaluator talks about divorce. Dr. Mike Kerner, welcome to Super Psyched.
Thank you, Adam.
So, dear listener, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background on the man with whom I'm speaking and who you get to learn from today. Back in the day, when I was considering becoming a psychologist, I asked two veteran local psychologists, who do I need to learn from? Who would be my Mr. Miyagi, my Obi-Wan Kenobi? And both my wife and the other, she was one of the veterans, they both said at the same time, Mike Kerner. And they looked at each other and started laughing like they couldn't believe that they both came to the same conclusion. And I, of course, asked why, and they explained why, and they described him. And then I got to take a course from him on licensure, this dreaded part of the psychology journey and becoming a psychologist. I'm sitting in a room with nearly 100 people, all of whom have Ph.D s, all of whom are studying for the national and Canadian exam. And Mike is up there teaching how to take the test. During the breaks, unbeknownst to Mike, people are talking about Mike. They're saying, he's the best teacher I've ever had. And these are people all who have doctorates, presumably at least 20 years of schooling. And they all proclaimed the same thing, that you were the best. And I just wanted to start with that.
Thank you. That's very gracious.
And I'm not being gracious. It was all accurate. And then what we're going to be talking today is about divorce and custody evaluation. And I guess I'd like to start with divorce. What are some common myths about divorce? And how might you correct those myths with some truths?
Well, maybe I'll start with a statistic that I read it in the Chronicle, so it must be accurate. And it said that 69% of the children in the Bay Area live in single family homes or blended. And so one thing I want to say is that there's a profound number of kids who are impacted by divorce, just based on the numbers of kids who have that kind of sort of newer, but it's not a minority, of a custody schedule where they go either two homes or have a blended family home. And so the times have really changed.
And what would you say are the repercussions of that?
Well, I bet there's a myriad number of impacts. I think that societal changes have impacted so many things, and how we parent, and how we parent is impacted by that, because in so many families you have step parents, or whether the parties remarry or not. And these are difficult dynamics. Kids have so much to cope with that adds another very complex layer of ability to cope.
And are there any longitudinal statistics on how people fare when they are in houses of divorce, or perhaps in single parent settings that didn't experience divorce but were?
Well, one series of studies that I think has been looked at in detail is the impact on kids who go through divorce, either relocation, where one parent moves away, or just the impacts. There's a lot of research on just how do children fare when the parents are warring or not? And I think it's a really easy takeaway. And it would be that the more the children perceive the parents to have disdain or venom for each other, the harder, the worse the outcome, the child's mental health. And the important word there is perceive, because you can have two parents that have a lot of disdain for each other. If the children are not aware of it, it seems to have minimal impact. It's when the children become either embroiled in it, aware of it, or live it, that there's absolutely negative impacts and things that you can measure. There's the ACEs test that just looks at childhood trauma. And unfortunately, when parents are high conflict and they bring it in front of the kids, to me, that might be the number one negative impact on children. And there's research that would verify that.
I wrote down the word perceive, and you said, of course, the key word here is perceive. And one of the hardest things for me as a therapist who's attending to someone who's going through a divorce is sometimes one or both of the parties in the divorce don't play fair and don't recognize that it's more important to love your child even more than you hate your ex-spouse. And what I mean by that is I see the parent expressing the venom, the vitriol toward the ex-spouse on the child, and somehow trying to nearly manipulate the child into thinking that the other parent is bad, not realizing that the word perceive is going to come in, and the perception of the divorce and the long-term impact on the ACEs, as you referred to, the adverse childhood experiences. But they seem to hate their ex more than they love their child, and they may not know the adverse impact that they're having on their child.
I think it's true that part of the work that I do in a lot of families is try to, without doing a blame game, really increase their awareness or bust their denial about what they're doing. If I can, let me just share. About a year ago, I had an 8-year-old sitting in my office. 8, not necessarily a gifted kid, just an average, maybe typical kid. So not an exceptional kid that is some Mensa child. But we did an exchange of mom and dad right in my office because they had some really terrible experiences at exchanges with cross allegations that were very, very over the top in front of the 8-year-old. So I said, hey, look, why don't we do the exchange right here in my office since your son's going to be here? And at the end of the exchange, I said, hey, Mom, how did the exchange go? And she said, oh, Dr. Kerner, you were right there, of course. I mean, he didn't do what he normally does. He didn't, and so it went great. Well, at least it went as great as it could. Dad, how'd it go? How'd the exchange go? I asked Dad, and he said, well, you were right there. So of course it went really well. And he explained that normally mother's just horrible and will cast explicative deleteds at him. And he went on that way. And then I asked the 8-year-old, and he said the same answer. I said, so Brandon, how did that exchange go? And he said, Dr. Kerner, you were right there. You saw it. They hate each other. I said, oh, can you tell me why you say that? He goes, you were right there. My mother comes in, and if my father's there, she walks like a robot. And I think she stops breathing. And she kind of walked by him into this room. And then my father, he talks to everybody, but he doesn't even look at my mother. He doesn't even acknowledge her. And to me, I wish I could have had one of those little videos to make a YouTube moment about it, because I just thought from the 8-year-old's perspective, it was so different than the two parents who thought it was certainly at least okay. He came away saying they hate each other. And I think that there's just a lot of learning what it's like to be 8 years old and looking at your parents, for instance, had an exchange, something as simple as an exchange where there was no words exchanged.
And yet it sounds like within the no words exchanged, you could feel the violence.
The venom, and kids were all carry a part of our parents as our own identity. And so when they feel one of those parents is unreasonable, bad, maybe told that that parent's bad, it affects kids' self-esteem and how they feel about themselves. So the impacts are really very significant. When parents remain at war with each other, it's a very significant impact.
I wrote down the word carry, and I know Brandon is a pseudonym for this client.
Right.
But I'm imagining Brandon as he goes through life without attention, without proper correction, he will be carrying the equivalent of a huge backpack that is basically attached to him and not detachable, carrying so much weight. I know we often call it baggage, but there's something so much visceral about carrying a heavy backpack that was never yours to begin with through life. And it's so unfair that the child is basically hit in this crossfire. And I guess I was wondering if you had the ability to educate or direct Brandon's parents and help them find a way to reduce that adverse impact on him, what would that advice be?
Well, Adam, I'd like to sort of quote you a bit there because you had said to love your child more than you hate your ex. And really what I'm trying to do when I work with couples like this is to give them insight into the impact that they're typically unwittingly having on their kid. Yeah. So I think that's part of the work if you're doing work with post-married, separated, or divorced individuals.
And yet I imagine that there is a recalcitrant, really rigid reaction when you try to present the possibility of them hating their spouse less than they love their child.
Well, I find in my work as a therapist or as someone who does custody evaluations or parent coordinated work or emergency screenings, I always ask the same sort of two questions. And one certainly is, have you ever had children? Because I think it leaves an indelible footprints. And two, do you take responsibility or do you blame? And in working with folks who take responsibility, I find there's lots of possible ways and avenues for all of us to grow. And all of us make mistakes as parents, and all of us make mistakes in divorce. And so I think that if they don't take responsibility, the prognosis is pretty guarded to make change. So I underline that question in terms of working with people. If they can take a look at themselves, is there some insight there, and can they take responsibility?
And if they can't, and it's funny because I'm noticing that this conversation is probably going to change in terms of its content. It's probably going to be more like protecting your child in the face of a heated divorce. What can be done? And I guess I'm wondering, in that theme, what could be done if the parents are not open to changing, if they hate each other more than they love their child, so to speak? What can be done to help the child so that they don't have to carry as big of a backpack?
Sometimes you can make the focus on the parent and show how it could be better for them. For instance, financially. One of the things that you can do, if it's a little more of a self-centric kind of person and not necessarily all about the kid, you can really point out the brutal costs of ongoing battle with professionals like myself, attorneys. The attorney costs can be really, unfortunately for some people, life-changing. And so something you can do is just a little reality testing and walk them through the process of what is likely to happen. And if they can't take the impact on their child as enough of a impetus to make change.
Have you used any tools or any stories that have been very effective in conveying this message to parents?
Well, I often try to use stories. I know one case that I can think of, I had two attorneys call me, and they had shared in a pretty brief call that they had couples, because each parent had coupled up, and so there was 4 parents, and that the couples had each spent $400,000 fighting. And now that number sounds sort of like supernatural or absurd, but sadly not remote. $400,000. So I asked the attorneys, well, what are you asking of me? And they said, well, we're scheduled for a multi-week trial coming up. And we're wondering if we could hire you for 2 hours to settle things or see if you could sell things. I said, isn't that almost rude to these people who have spent endless dollars fighting to say in 2 hours they're going to come in and get somewhere? So I said, look, I'm willing to meet with them for 2 hours. Maybe they can settle something. And so with that, I will tell you that I did something that I had never done before. I called up the mother and the father, and I said very little to them. In fact, I don't typically call people before they come in for the first time. I have someone who works with me and does that. But I made the phone call personally, and I said, please make sure to bring a checkbook so you can write me a check when you come in. That's all I said. So I certainly felt the warm vibes come from that phone call. Now I go to the waiting room, and there are 4 adults there. And I want you to know that these 4 adults were very, very Silicon Valley kind of individuals. And what I mean by that is successful, bright, articulate. I think, by the way, they cared about their two kids.
Mm-hmm.
And all four of them are what I would call middle managers of major companies. And all of us know major companies. And I'm not going to cite the companies they work for, but it'd be companies like a Cisco or Facebook or Google, major companies that all of us would know the name of. So these are very accomplished people also. And when they're in the waiting room, what did I say to them? Did you bring a checkbook? And so the two sentences I had with them were about money. And they both said yes. And when I invite them up in the office, I said, can you take out your checkbook, please? And so I think now they thought this is a low-life person that they have hired to help them for 2 hours. And I asked them to write a 1-hour check for my services, each of them, and put it on the table. And then I asked them to write a second check. And they sort of hesitated. I said, no, you need to. And I asked them to write a second check for $10,000 each. And they did it. I said, you don't have to fill out the name, but I need it on the table. And now a third check, $95,000 each. Fill it out, put it on the table. We have an hour and 52 minutes left. If we're successful, you pick up 2 of those checks. And if not, you'll fill them in. You'll get an expert. You'll have a trial. And so I use money.
Wow. Oh, my God.
So I do want to say that at the end of 2 hours, we actually made some inroads. And at the end of 2 hours, one of the 4 folks, and they were very reasoned with each other, by the way, these really were very high functioning individuals who had gotten into the grinder of this divorce process. And as they were standing up and leaving, they asked, can we do this again? Can we do another 2 hours? Because there was some fruit out of this. And I said, I really appreciate you saying that, but no, I'm so sorry, I can't do it. And then they're walking out the door. I said, wait, I'm going to make you a deal. Here's the deal. In fact, there were 3 children, as I recall the story, because I said to them, here's the deal. You have 3 kids. My deal is this. If one couple invites the other couple over for a drink, and I don't mean alcohol drink, but, tea, where you invite the other couple to your house to have a drink, the children don't know about it in advance, but they see it occur. So they're just like, whoa, mom's here with her new husband, or dad's here with his new wife. And they see it occur. And if you do that, you call me up and I'll give you 2 more hours. And so 3 weeks later, I got a call. They did it. They came in for 2 hours and they basically fired me and the attorneys, meaning they settled after $800,000 of hating each other. They found a way and a path. And I think that
for conceivably a ridiculous bargain.
Yeah, I think I'm going to raise my rates after that. To me, I think that was truly the most successful cases that I ever entered into. And I always think the secret of happiness is certainly low expectations. And they had low expectations. I had low expectations, and we were able to get somewhere. But I think I also had the ability to be working with 4 adults who were, I think, high-functioning individuals when given a chance not to spend money just fighting and hating each other. And I think that probably had a great impact on the children. So I didn't follow with the children, so I can't tell you, but I cannot imagine anything but a great outcome for the kids.
And if you're comfortable sharing it, what were some of the instructions, lessons, values you attempted to imbue to that foursome, 2 people with new spouses each? What did you hope they would gain from these 2-hour meetings?
One of the first things is the impact on the kids. And so what I told them, which we'll often say, is that when I meet kids who are 7 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old, 10, 11, especially in that age range, and younger as well, you can almost feel on the children like a plaster of Paris. When their parents are hating and fighting each other, it comes to the children and they lose that spontaneity, the joy of childhood. Even a 5-year-old, they come in and they're kind of frozen a bit in this angst, the pressure, the loyalty concerns, the venom, and they wear it like a plaster of Paris. They're just not the easygoing, joyous, carefree kids that you see when that's not going on. And that's something that I tried to emphasize with these people as a way to say, hey, you're fighting for your children's mental health, as well as, of course, their future and their ability to.
And I just want to make sure I understand what a plaster of Paris is.
Well, if you put it on, it actually will harden like a cast.
Exactly.
Like if you break your arm, if you put plaster of Paris on, it'll form a cast. And so what I'm saying is the kids became much more rigid and less flexible, less just the joy of life and spontaneous, and more tight, rigid, bound up. And I feel like those of us in this industry that deal with children whose parents are in this high conflict world where venom's easily being shared, yeah, you could feel it on the children. You can literally feel it and experience if you spend some therapeutic time with them.
So I'm wondering, what you're describing has been rather consistent with various types of traumas in childhood that I've seen. I've seen grown-ups with analexithymic presentation, which means that they have difficulty putting words to their emotions because they've almost become divorced from them. They've had to become rather waxen, is the term I use, like plaster of Paris. That's a great one. And it's a tragedy. And one of the things I hope to do, because the brain is so plastic, I've even seen that very grown adults for whom these experiences were multiple decades before, they're able to experience a greater range of emotion, and that plaster can be taken away or at least reduced. I'm wondering, when you refer children to therapists to help them attend to the traumas, their perceptions of the divorce, the possibility that they might even say, oh my gosh, I'm to blame for mommy and daddy's divorce. It's my fault, which of course it's not. What are some of the things that you would hope a well-informed child pediatric therapist will do?
So typically, a well-informed child or pediatric therapist is going to need to have background with high conflict families, because there are variables that learning about the court system, what they've experienced, I think helps a lot. I think people that you refer to need a very, very complex, thorough understanding of domestic violence, and that's a very large term, because there are many, many cases that are influenced by domestic violence that come through high conflict divorce cases. And I think you also need a colleague who has requisite background in chemical dependency and addictive behaviors, because those are important themes that many times can underlie or interface with these families that are high conflict. So those are some of the prerequisites that I'm often looking for.
Those are great prerequisites. And I'm wondering about the unteachables. I'm guessing that the therapist should also have a very alive and well inner child, so that they're able to connect and attend and attune to the child in a way that the child really feels felt, perhaps even the capacity to play with the child, to keep the play within them alive.
I think that's, again, you use a phrase, this one's hard to operationalize, but I do think there are some people that connect with kids just almost all the time. And is it a joy of life? Is it a childhood piece of that therapist? There's a non-blaming kind of I hear you approach where the child feels held and safe. That is art of therapy. And when you find a therapist that can do that, that is special. I would also add self-care. You have to find a therapist that has a way to take care of herself or himself, because these cases are very difficult. And when you enter into the high conflict world, the biggest and easiest mistake we can make, like the number one rookie mistake, is to kind of get polarized into one position rather than remaining open to the experience of both parents, sort of begin to pull to one side and become pro-mom, become pro-dad. And usually that is the hallmark of a therapeutic relationship that is going to be problematic and not successful.
On the opposite end of the spectrum of cognitive rigidity, which is obviously something that children may experience when they're traumatized and have a fairly high ACEs score, is cognitive flexibility. And Mike, I got to tell you straight up, both of my children have met you. Both of them just say, Mike is so cool. And before the conversation, you're one of these people who, no matter how old you get, there will always be an alive and well inner child. Now, I'm going to go a little bit off, because I believe, and I've interviewed a lot of comedians, I've taken great interest in the brain of a comedian. You have a comedian's brain. You think big, you think outside the box, and you're also able to say things that really land the way a really good comedian can. And by the way, you're funny as hell during your trainings. We walk out smarter, and we've been laughing our asses off all the while. I'm just hearing from you that you're able to see things rather, for lack of a better term, talmudically. You're able to see things from various angles. It's almost like the movie Rashomon, where 7 people describe an event in very different language, and that you're able to see all of these things the way a comedian can through that cognitive flexibility. What I'm getting from you is you're able to see all the sides.
Well, thank you. I think that probably our backgrounds developmental histories impact that. I think mine certainly does, whether it was my own family of origin issues and having a fairly dysfunctional dad, as well as 7 years in the Catskills. Hey, maybe that's where I worked on those skills of humor.
That's really great. So yeah, you grew up in a rather chaotic home. Your brother becomes a cop. You become pretty much, in many ways, a forensic psychologist. You become a guy who throws himself into a space that I remember a forensic psychologist describing as scarier than working with 100 cold-blooded killers. I remember this forensic psychologist telling me, I would rather be in a room with 100 cold-blooded killers than do one single custody evaluation. And yet that's where you decided to go. And kind of like a Blue Angels pilot, kind of like a Top Gun pilot, you have to have nerves of steel. You're dealing with people who will be mad at you. You're dealing with opposing attorneys who will cross-examine you. You're dealing with all kinds of really, really pained vitriol coming from the parents, because for them, they're going through pretty much the worst experience of their lives. How in the world did you decide to do this?
Sometimes I wonder, because actually I'm a person who likes to be liked. And
oh my God.
Yeah, exactly. And by the nature, if you do custody evaluation work, it will engender antipathy, and many times people will look at you with the anger that they were holding or still are for their ex. So in that way, it is a difficult space to work in at times. I will also say, though, that it's a very necessary place, I think, for psychologists. Otherwise, you're leaving for two attorneys and let the most skilled attorney win the day, because the judge needs input. And if you can give clinical input, the state of California has really done a lot of very good things around custody work. And there are a multitude of rules of court that have to be followed to try to keep a standard of care that helps with the reliability of what we do. So hopefully the therapeutic input that the judge receives helps children. So that would be, as we say, the mitzvah of the work. And that would be the good deed, but it can be a tough space.
And in spite of the antipathy that you must receive, because somebody's going to hate you in this equation, I've spoken to a surprisingly high number of family court judges. I've spoken to a lot of family law attorneys. They all adore you. And I remember sharing a wall with you. We worked in the same office for about 8 years. And I remember you'd be walking up the stairs and there would be an entire parade of family law attorneys, and they absolutely adored you. Let's talk about a story where a psychologist, you, entered the courtroom and perhaps changed an outcome for the better as you see it. I know there are many of them, but not many. I imagine there's a preponderance of them, to use a court word. But
I can think of a very old story where I thought that my input really was most significant. And it was just a story of a parent. And I want to be careful even picking a gender here, because people hear this and go, oh, he hates men or he hates women. And in this case, it happened to be a mom who had a lot of problems at the time. She was overwhelmed with chemical dependency, alcoholism specifically, and other problems that were very significant. And the way I would define this to anyone listening would be that they had one kid together, and on her fourth birthday, the party was just going to be mom and dad because of the difficulty of where the family was at. Mom was a no-show. And it was kind of worse than that in terms of why she was a no-show. But mom needed a lot of help to get back into the game of being any kind of safe and reasoned parent. And I will say in that case, initially, there was something done that was done at the courthouse through the Family Court Services. And they just rubber stamped it. And the rubber stamp came back, Dad, every other weekend and Wednesday night dinners. So it was kind of back then, maybe almost the typical. And I thought, oh my God, this is devastating and maybe endangering. And in that case, I remember being very instrumental in a judge saying, well, let's do it the other way. So maybe 10 years later, and again, 15 years later, I came into my office and there was a thank you from the dad who had just had Thanksgiving, looked across the table and said, hey, I was just at Thanksgiving. I thought of you and I wanted you to know that. So there are moments that are very, very heartwarming.
And you've basically, in this case, and in so many cases, we're in the courtroom, sitting in the stand as an expert, weighing in, telling them what your expert opinion was based on objective measurements.
That's the hope. We look for reliability. Reliability is really a mathematical term. Reliability is multiple points of information sort of taking you to the same place. And that way it is mathematical. And the more reliable means you have more data points that point in the same direction. So maybe colleagues who have looked at this and look at it the same way, or instruments. So the more data points you have, the better the reliability. And that's the hope. The hope is that we're continuing to improve and increasing the reliability of what we do and giving opinions to the court, which are just incredibly relevant.
Yeah. And I would add the word validity. I'm sure reliability and validity are pretty much everything that you're about. And
Yes.
I'm just so delighted that you're in the field and that I've gotten to learn from you, Mike. I feel a little teary as I think about you as my big brother. As you know, I did not go in your path, did not enter the world of custody, perhaps slightly to your chagrin, but I'm wondering if you were to let others know who may be considering entering this most important field. I would even say it's a field of, I have no better word than to say it's holy work, because you're trying to make things whole in this way. How would you encourage somebody who might be a little on the fence, a little scared about doing this work, because it is scary, but how might you encourage somebody?
And I agree. I often feel like I'm dancing on sacred ground and try to at least do the best job I'm capable of. We all make mistakes, and I'm sure I do too, but never should be for who has more money or who has one attorney or another. It should only be based on the best effort a psychologist can put forth. To the colleagues, to answer your question, I think that the state of California has a rule of court that insists that colleagues who begin this work in California, who call it 730 appointments, they have to do substantial participation in at least 4 evaluations with someone who has experienced. That's remarkably important, because then people can get a sense themselves personally and professionally how well suited they are. So over the past years, I've been trying to give service to the community. One way I do it is have colleagues in my practice one at a time, often for a year at a time, where they will sit and do evaluations with me. And so over the past 5 years, I think there's been 5 different colleagues. And of those 5 who have gone through, and one, she stayed a year and a half. Of those 5 colleagues who really put a lot of their time in sitting with me, perhaps doing an entire custody evaluation, which could be easily 20 direct hours of clinical interview for one evaluation. Of those 5, 2 are pursuing the active role as custody evaluator currently. 2 are absolutely not considering it, and maybe stay doing adjunctive work, but not custody evaluation work. One person is literally just putting her foot into it for the first time to see. So I think that's long-winded. I apologize, but I think experiencing what this world is like, because it is important that you get a sense of what's necessary and to do it right and to do it thoroughly.
Perhaps another question I might ask is, what are the qualities of a person who might do well in this very tension-laden field of custody evaluation?
Yeah, I feel like there's probably a lot of different types of us that are doing it. One type of forensic person, which goes along with training, is they keep themselves very removed. So when you meet with them, you might feel like you're meeting with someone who's not your therapist, certainly, or not even maybe a therapist, as more an evaluator. And I think the stance there is we're taught to try to stay neutral. And so you can see how a stance like that keeps from therapeutic alliances building or anything that goes outside of the neutrality. I think there are a number of us that do this work that come out of the therapeutic world and try to keep a forensic relationship, which is different than a clinical relationship, but still have more clinical connectedness with individuals going through the process. So I try to remember everybody coming through. They're all people, they're all parents, they all have so much at stake. So I think that those are important things to keep in mind. And I feel like I'm getting smarter. There's a couple of organizations that really focus on just this part of the world of psychology. AFCC is a group that has judges, family lawyers, and those therapists that are involved in the world of custody. You'll have very, very contemporary kinds of lectures on wide numbers of topics that are remarkably relevant about how to do this work. And the lawyers have an association called AAML, and they put on national workshops as well. And so I find I go to these workshops and it helps me broaden my background and keep looking at what I do to try to keep doing it better.
What you're describing right now is what I believe is a key differentiator between psychologists and therapists when they are able to not rest on their laurels and continue to learn as if they're a beginner. So here you are, you've been doing this for a long time. You have many thousands of hours of custody evaluation experience, and you've taught it at the doctoral level at Palo Alto University, which is part of the Stanford Consortium. And yet you stay thirsty.
Well, I hope so. I hope so, because maybe that's part of what is appealing to me. You need background in so many areas of psychology to try to do this well. Psychological testing, interviewing children, sexual abuse in children, domestic violence and the ramifications, resilience in children, how to deal with the very common disorders that we deal with kids and adults, and from anxiety to depression, because so often so much of that is a part of the people that we're dealing with. Attention deficit disorder is rampant in the children that we deal with. Special needs children, which go beyond ADHD to so many other categories, whether it's spectrum disorder. So I could talk for a long time in just the categories that you have to keep trying to learn. And so I had an experience that I thought was interesting to me, Adam, because this is I have to use my fingers to add this up, what year practice this is. So this is my 36th year practice. And about a decade ago, so I'd been in practice many years, I became a volunteer with the domestic violence death review team here in Santa Clara County. It's run by the DA's office. And what was interesting to me is I had been an evaluator for many years, and I felt like I had learned a lot about domestic violence after all those years by sitting on that committee, meaning every happy woman, because the years I was there, it was all women who were killed because of domestic violence. Every single case of death in Santa Clara County must come through that committee, I guess you could call it, run by the DA's office. So they have police department there, and CPS would be there, or next door, which is a shelter for battered folks. And they would try to understand what happened. Was there a dropping the ball somewhere? And then yearly, they would make recommendations back to court as to things that could be done better or differently. And I do think it was interesting that I'd been doing this for many years. And I do feel, even though there's a demand on us for 4 hours a year of continuing education credits, if you do this work in domestic violence specifically, I thought it was interesting. I'd been doing this a lot of years. I felt like I learned a lot sitting on that committee. So I think it is important that you stay wide open to continuing to learn in all these different categories.
Couldn't agree more. You mentioned ADHD a moment ago. This is a chicken and egg question, and this is going to be an impossible one for you to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway, Mike. With the seemingly increased numbers, nearly at epidemic levels, particularly amongst children of divorce, of ADHD of various types, what do you think is going on here? Why does it seem to be so high if it's a biological impairment?
Well, are there things that happen in a child's life that could impact that biology? In other words, can the neurotransmitters be affected by stimulation, gaming? In other words, can these things impact? And probably, like so many things in our life, there's a myriad set of causes. But I would agree, ADHD does seem to be an increasing issue in numbers. The DSM-5, I think, notes percentages between 5. Some studies might go as high as 8% of children, which is a huge number. But it seems even higher in the world of custody. I also think it's really easy to get a false positive diagnosis.
Yep.
What I mean by that is the children look ADHD because, well, there's types of ADHD. You have your hyperactive type that everybody can understand, the kid that'll run into the street, the kid that can't sit still in a classroom, the kid that can't stop talking in classroom, the kid that motorically is just on the go. And it's like, did that kid have a couple shots of caffeine? But the inattentive type, that's the type, where that person's missing their executive personal secretary. They say it's a prefrontal cortex issue. And I get a lot of kids that seem to be suffering with that, and they can't organize, they can't do homework, they can't plan. Their internal secretary is amiss. The third type, of course, is combined. So why is it going up? Probably goes out of my ability to certainly be anything close to definitive, but I do worry the early gaming and excessive hours of stimulation may be an impact, but divorce itself makes kids anxious, makes kids fearful, makes kids have sleeping problems. These things look like ADHD. So I never want to give a diagnosis in a custody evaluation because these kids will give you a false positive, very high frequency. So I think you need to sort of get past the family trauma. You had mentioned the word trauma earlier. This is a family trauma. So children have to get past this trauma before you really want to assess for ADHD. But I think that my experience is that kids have just so much more access now to very high stimulating things early in life that I would say, how could that not have an impact on the brain and the neurotransmitters and the need for stimulation? So I think you can see just in many walks, even giving lectures to professionals. I was recently giving a talk to attorneys and I quit because I was the 7th speaker of the day.
Oh my God. Nobody wants to do that.
Yeah, right. So I started with like some empirical data. And so when I was getting around with them with the empirical data, it was like, what percentage of them were attending me? How many were making reservations for Southwest Airlines?
How many people were paying attention to you?
Were you there? And
of course I was. I follow you everywhere.
So I think that the children and the need for stimulation is part of what is looking a lot like ADHD coming more into.
Ew.
Yeah, because they get on the computer.
Totally. That connected because you read the room. They were not.
Practice. Until the DSM publishes increased numbers, I'll stick with that. And the easy number, 5%, the high number, 8%.
Right. And the way you described the various types in such understandable parlance, my own ADHD is the inattentive type. It wasn't identified till I was 27. And as I told you offline, the only reason I learned Japanese, I believe now in retrospect, was because everyone told me I was stupid. I needed some evidence that I was not. And as you've said, the executive secretary was on a very long-term vacation or poorly employed at best. So I just love the way you describe that. And I would say that a byproduct of being a custody evaluator is you are seeing so many different presentations of psychology itself. It's almost as if every day that you're in a custody evaluation, you're going back to school.
I think that's true. Adam, I'd mentioned the ACEs test earlier. For people that don't know that, that's Adverse Childhood Experience Scale. It's actually kind of a remarkable empirical tool because it's very, very simple. You can look it up online. And I know Kaiser did a very big study.
Right.
And their study, which had a very, very large N, thousands of people took it. The reason I bring up ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experience Scale, is that the correlation that they showed was not just to fear or a false ADHD, but to absolute medical conditions coming out of adverse childhood experiences. So as the score went up with children who had adverse childhood experiences, their medical consequences went up later in life. And I think that's something that all of us should pay attention to and can help parents in high conflict say the ramifications of you working together and to love your child, it might be much greater than you think. It may be more than mental health. And of course, mental health, you and I are going to put out a very high value, but it also impacts so much of medical health according to the research.
Yeah, it seems that the longitudinal effects of it even impact one's immune system and the susceptibility toward a flu and so many, just scores of other things. The way I'm kind of hearing it, this is going to sound super glib and my apologies for it, but it's almost like the mandate to parents is, I know you're pissed off at your spouse. It sucks. This is the worst moment of your life. I have empathy for that. Find a way to contain your hate for that person and try to help your child, unless they're in some type of immediate danger, try to help your child love each of you and definitely let them know that this is not their fault. Is that accurate? And if it's not, please tell me it's not. And if it's incomplete, what would you add to it?
Well, I certainly think staying with children, letting them voice their feelings, sometimes having a therapist is helpful. There's nothing that I wouldn't agree with what you just said. In the world that I deal in, so often when we're looking at families and individuals, we're really trying to see the type of parenting and also the impact. And when we say impact, on one end, researchers will use this term realistic estrangement, because right now we have a lot of kids who are rejecting parents, more so than ever before in my practice. We've all just gone through COVID, and it's like another pandemic of kids rejecting parents, which is much newer. And so much, there's a term of art now called refuse resist dynamic. It's really, really common that we're getting this in evaluations and family therapy. And so there's a range. Realistic estrangement means, hey, parents have done things to push the kid away. And if you can find that, maybe you can help the parent make a change. Like, is it attunement? Can they read and understand their kid or kids? Is there a substance issue? Are they being self-centered in a way that the kids feel ignored? In other words, are they abusive? Are they abusive to a spouse and the kids see it? This all falls under realistic estrangement. On the other side of the scale, you have a term that people are trying not to use anymore, alienation. We have parents who are telling kids that the other parent is terrible or horrible or has bad things in his or her background. And so in this field of looking at families, I think what we're trying to do is to try to assess that sort of range, because then you can also make recommendations to try to give help to the parent so the kids aren't on the receiving end of one end of that spectrum or the other.
That is so important. And I do see that phenomenon quite a lot, where a parent actually has been kind to the child, has been a good enough parent, to use a term. And yet there is that alienation. You're saying that term is no longer in favor. Why has that term fallen out of favor? That seems to be perfect.
Yeah, the term alienation is a term that the literature will say has just never been empirically based. And so perhaps I could just leave it at that.
Not supposed to be used.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of people have replaced it with refuse resist dynamics. And there's a lot of very wonderful stuff written on that. And
refuse resist dynamics. Got it.
Yeah. And in that, you can perhaps incorporate parents being less than optimal with kids. So I think that for me, when I'm dealing with high conflict families, if there's a way I can be helpful, is to try to look at the dynamic that's underlying the separation or divorce. And that's this range that we're talking about now, realistic estrangement on one end, alienation or refuse resist dynamic, so to speak, on the other. And then you also look at the type of parenting that's going on. There's different labels that we give to different kind of parenting. And the easy ones that you often hear would be things like permissive parenting on one end, authoritarian parenting on the other. And the ideal is more authoritative, where you talk with your kids. And then you look for how resilient people are. And these to me are ingredients that you're trying to put together if you're making recommendations that could be helpful for the court. And it's kind of the common language that I think a lot of people in the industry of assessing these families try to use to help the judge. He or she has to make determinations about child timeshare, things like that. So yeah, I think there's a fair body of research that go into those labels. It's an ongoing process too. So that's why you got to stay current and keep learning.
Could not agree more. So Mike, I'm going to ask you my final and magical question that I ask all of my guests. And that is this: if you had the magical powers to confer upon all humanity one insight or skill that would dramatically improve their lives, what would that insight or skill be? And how do you imagine it would improve the lives of the individual as well as perhaps the people around them? One skill, one insight that you think is super important.
What comes to my mind is to be able to listen in a way that does not necessarily mean you have to respond verbally. But to hear somebody, I think, is incredibly important. When people feel heard, all kinds of things are possible in relationships as well as parenting.
Oh my gosh, Mike. This has been so great to sit with you and have a high-level conversation with you on your expertise. I just can't thank you enough for sharing with my listeners and for taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedule to be with me this afternoon.
I'm honored, and I just appreciate what you're doing for the community with the podcast, and I always have appreciated what you do personally in your office. So great to say hello.
Oh, so good to see you, buddy. This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.